Life can be filled with hard moments. Moments of grief, moments of sorrow, moments of tragedy, moments of loss. Life can be filled with hard moments. Moments that leave you searching for hope, sitting in the dark. There's an old saying, there are no atheists in a foxhole. It was popularized during and following the days of World War II. And the intent of the statement, the idea behind it is that there are moments, there are seasons of life where you spend so much time face to face with death, with destruction, with the worst sort of human violence, and that in those moments you'll find yourself confronted with your own mortality, which often leads people to long for or cry out to a God that maybe they weren't sure even existed. And no doubt history is filled with what we would call foxhole conversions. But I wonder, what about the times, what about the people for whom it seems to go the other way? What do we do with those times when life's circumstances bring you face to face with death, with destruction, with loss, with the worst sort of human violence and suffering, and leaves you wondering if there could be any good God out there at all? Because what might make one person lean into the sacred may cause another to drift toward the cynical. And the reality is, those sorts of moments face us all. Hopefully not consistently, hopefully not on a day in, day out basis, but we all face these moments where we come face to face with the brokenness of sin, the brokenness of the world around us, the way in which things are not as they should be. Whether it's the headlines of war around the globe, when the process of niceties and negotiations gives way to bullets and bombs, and the human toll begins to be calculated in the thousands. Maybe it's the breaking news alert of yet another school shooting. The Twitter notification of another instance of racial violence and unrest. Maybe it's those moments like we woke up to this morning of a young man in our community shot dead at 18 years old. What do we do when moments like that strike close? First, we extend our heartfelt and sincere grace and sympathies to the families of those who are involved. Multiple lives are forever changed. And life has a way of bringing all of us into those sorts of moments in one way or another, where we're confronted by the way things are, and we know there's something deep within us that says this is not the way it should be. We aren't hard-pressed for reasons to lament. And that means that there are no shortage of opportunities for us to either lean into or abandon faith. And so over the course of this conversation, So we've been exploring the book of Lamentations together. We've seen the way that the hard moments of life ask us hard questions. What do you do when the lights go out, when the world around you collapses, where it feels as if everything has gone wrong? And so far in this conversation, we've seen the way that the book of Lamentations not only is wrestling with that tension, but as we saw last week, it has this incredible gift, this incredible knack within the text of Lamentations to not just wrestle with the tension, but to raise it to new heights. Because as we looked together last week, what we saw is that the poet behind the book of Lamentations, the personified city of Lady Zion, both at different times in the book, look at the destruction that has happened around them, look at the incredible death toll that has mounted, and they have no choice but to say, this is God's doing. That it might not be His fault, but it's His doing. The God as the sovereign King of all creation, as the keeper of the covenant with His people, that He has unleashed the punishment that He promised them for idolatry, for disobedience, for unbelief. Lamentations wrestles with this tension and raises it to new heights for us. And we might think that is reason enough to drift towards the cynical, to lean away from the sacred. But as the book of Lamentations begins to come to a close, the poet goes the opposite direction. As the book begins to come to a close, the poet cries out to God. And specifically, and I think significantly, cries out to Yahweh, the God of the covenant. He invokes the covenant name of God, which he does not often do throughout the book. When he cries out to God, pleading for God to come and rescue them if He will. Let's look together at the beginning of Lamentations chapter 5. If you're following along in the YouVersion Bible app this morning, you'll find everything on the screen. The text will be there. You can jot some things down as we go along, fill in some blanks, take some notes if that's helpful to you. We have a little bit more time with the book of Lamentations, but we want to come to the end today so that we can kind of see where we're headed and then back up. So Lamentations chapter 5, starting in verse 1, we hear the poet say this: "Remember, O Lord, what has happened to us. Look and see our disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to aliens, our homes to foreigners. We have become orphans and fatherless, our mothers like widows. We must buy the water we drink. Our wood can be had only at a price. Those who pursue us are at our heels. We are weary and find no rest. We submitted to the Egyptians and the Assyrians just to get enough bread." Amidst all of the brokenness and the destruction of Jerusalem, the poet of Lamentations cries out and says, "Remember us, O Lord." Now, throughout the Old Testament, whenever God is called upon to remember, or we're told that God remembers His people, it comes with high significance. We see it early in the Old Testament when God remembers Noah, when God remembers Abraham. God remembers Rachel, who is barren and longing for a child. We see it when God remembers His people Israel as they're enslaved in bondage in Egypt. And we see that God once again remembers Hannah, another barren mother, longing for a child. When the Old Testament tells us that God has remembered His people, it comes with a deep significance. It's also the language that the prophets use throughout the Old Testament to call God's people back to Him. They're called to remember the Lord your God. And when Israel persists in their idolatry, the prophets will say they did not remember the Lord. This is a significant ask on the part of the prophet. When we're told in the Old Testament that God remembers, it's not so much about forgetting as it is about focus. It's not that God has suddenly lost track of these things. It's that from the perspective of those asking God to remember them, He seems far away. He seems to have lost focus on their circumstance. And so this language of God remembering His people remembering the Lord, it brings to mind that there is a covenant relationship that exists. Right? When remembrance is being invoked, what are we supposed to remember? We're supposed to remember that God has called His people. He has entered into a relationship with them. He has set them apart for His purposes. And so amidst the destruction of Jerusalem, amidst the massive death tolls of the siege and all that came with it, the famine, the invasion of the army, Babylon, the poet of the book of Lamentations cries out, "Remember us, O Lord. Remember what has happened to us." And remarkably, the poet describes what has happened. And the poet says, what has happened is we have become like the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. Now, in the Old Testament, when we come across the word alien, we should think immigrants, not extraterrestrials. Okay, let's just make sure we're all on the same page, using language the right way. And throughout the Old Testament covenant, there were certain groups of people that God instructed His people to have compassion for because they had no one else to care for them. They were the resident alien, the foreigner among them. Widows and orphans. And here in Lamentations 5, the poet says, "Remember what has happened to us, O Lord, our inheritance has been turned over to aliens, to foreigners. What has been ours by the covenant has been taken. Our mothers are like widows. We've become orphans and fatherless." It's as if the poet is saying, remember what has happened to us, Lord. We have become the people You commanded us to have compassion for. Won't You have compassion for us? From there, the poet's going to go on in the next section of chapter 5 to detail the destruction that has unfolded, the suffering of God's people. And that suffering gives way to haunting words of God's sovereignty, to a desperate plea that their current reality will not become their permanent state. Let's jump to the end of the book in verse 19 of Lamentations 5. You, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures from generation to generation. Why do You always forget us? Why do You forsake us so long? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may return. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. Those are the words that the poet leaves us with. After detailing the suffering of God's people, the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, the poet asks, Lord, have we gone too far? Is the mess we've made irredeemable? And if we're reading the book of Lamentations like modern English readers, we're going to come to the end of the book and we're going to think, so is uncertainty its central message? Right? Because that's where we end up. And we're wired to think when we're reading a book from start to finish, wherever the book ends, that's where we kind of live. That's where the story concludes. And the book of Lamentations ends with this hanging question of the uncertainty of the future of God's people, of the covenant faithfulness of God. And so we're tempted to think that perhaps this uncertainty is the central message of the book. But it isn't. Now, I got to give you fair warning. We got to get like 85% nerdy today, okay? But bear with me, okay? Because I believe it's worth it for us to see the book of Lamentations as a whole for what it is and what it's trying to convey to us, okay? So we're going to get just a little bit nerdy. Buckle in, hold on. We'll push through as quick as we can, okay? The book of Lamentations, 5 chapters, is made up of 5 sort of individual poems that all kind of link together. Of those poems, 4 of them, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 4, and chapter 5, are acrostics of 22 verses. Now, an acrostic means a poem that starts with each succeeding letter of the alphabet, okay? So there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. There are 22 verses in chapter 1, 2, 4, and 5. In 3 of those 4, each verse begins with the next letter of the alphabet. Okay? So you see the structure that's being put before us here. It's as if the poet is structuring his message in a way to say, grief, destruction, loss, desperation, this book covers it all from A to Z. Or Aleph to Tav, as it would be more appropriate. But you get the idea, right? This is the whole thing. This is the totality of our suffering, of our desperation, of our cry to God to remember His people. Chapter 3 breaks that pattern slightly. Chapter 3 is not made up of 22 verses. It's made up of 66. And where the other poems have 3 lines in each verse, each line in chapter 3 is a single verse, a single point. There's almost in music, the staccato, the emphasis is on each hit, right? That's what's happening when we get to chapter 3. It's 3 times as long, and that means there are 3 lines that start with A, 3 lines that start with B and C, so on. Okay? That's part 1 of our trip to nerd. Just tuck that information in the back of your head. There's something happening. The way the poet is writing this book is intended to tell us something about the message of this book. Okay? That's part 1 of our trip into Nerdville. The other part, notion that we've run into before, that poetry in the Old Testament works a little differently than we think of poetry, right? In English, we think of poetry, we think of what? Rhyming words, right? This line ends with a word that sounds like this next line. The poetry of the Old Testament doesn't think of in terms of rhyming words so much as it thinks in terms of rhyming ideas. Okay, we bumped into this at a couple of different places. Last year when we dug into the book of Proverbs, we bumped into this concept. That's really optimistic. Anyway, optimistic that I'm tracking, that you're remembering a year ago when we talked about Proverbs. But that's beside the point, right? So this idea of rhyming ideas is part of the structure of the book. And the way this happens isn't just within a verse. This is where we get kind of nerdy again. It's the way the whole book is written. Okay? To break this down, I want to walk through this, if we can, here on the screen, because you'll start to see the pattern emerge in the book of Lamentations. So the first chapter is about what God has done to the city. Chapter 2 is a description of the city's despair. Okay, so this is what's happened. Here's our despair that has resulted. Chapter 4 tells us about the outcome of the despair. Okay, 2 and 4 are kind of a pair. Chapter 5 is a call for God to remember what has been done to the city. So what's been done to the city? The despair of the city. The despair of the city. What's been done to the city? You guys see the pattern. Okay? Chapter 3 then is the middle of this thing, which is the city's cry for justice and hope for renewal. Chapter 3 becomes the pivot point of the book. Now, structurally, when poetry in the Old Testament does this, it points the emphasis toward the middle. You put the most important part in the middle. Think of it like a sandwich, right? You could skip the bread if you had to. You want the stuff in the middle, right? Okay, so if we can go back to that last image. So chapter 1 and chapter 5 kind of echo. They're rhyming ideas. Chapter 2 and chapter 4, again, rhyme with one another. And at the point of emphasis, in the middle of the book, we find the poet directing us to hope. As he's sitting in the midst of the dark, in the middle of the book, and in the middle of chapter 3 even, like the very center of the book of Lamentations, is where we find the poet's most pressing analysis of hope. Check this out, Lamentations chapter 3. Let's back up and get into the heart of this. Starting in verse 19. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have what? Hope. I say, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. For his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him offer his cheek to the one who would strike him. Let him be filled with disgrace. For men are not cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to the children of men. Sitting in the dark with a front row seat to the brokenness of human sin, the poet points us to hope. And so in these moments of life when we find ourselves sitting in the dark with a front row seat to the brokenness of sin, often our own brokenness, right? Often the consequences of our own sin or disobedience, we can choose to either lean into the sacred or drift towards the cynical. And when the poet finds himself at the center of that dilemma, how do I respond to the desperation around me? He points us to hope. There in the teaching notes, if you want to jot it down, here's where Lamentations uses this structure to drive home its central message. In a life of faith, grief doesn't get the final word. Hope does. The book ends with all of this uncertainty hanging. We're going to come to that in a moment. But in a life of faith, grief doesn't get the final word. Hope does. And here in chapter 3, the poet points us to the character of God so that we can understand what lament is for. Because lament is an acknowledgement that everything is not as it should be. Lament is an acknowledgement that we have contributed to the brokenness all around us. But that even in the face of despair, we will bank on the faithfulness of God. That when we find ourselves sitting in the dark face to face with death and destruction and the worst sorts of human violence, we will trust God to be who He has said He is. That we will trust God to be who He has revealed Himself to be throughout our past. That's why the poet says, remember us. Remember us? Your people? Do you know who we are, Lord? Do you know the relationship we have? Do you remember all the things that you have brought us through? Do you remember the times when we were counted out and you brought us back? Lord, remember your people. So in light of who God has said He will be, who He has revealed Himself over and over to be, in a life of faith, grief doesn't get the final word. Hope does, always. And by putting that message at the center of this book, with these rhyming ideas of despair all around it, the poet is forcing our attention to chapter 3. He wants to make sure we know where this idea, where his theology is centered, while refusing to ignore the brokenness all around him. He brings us to a point of hope. And then in chapter 4 begins to remind us once again what has happened and the despair of God's people. Because hope doesn't resolve the tension. Right? Hope doesn't magically make everything okay. Wouldn't it be great if it did? Like if you just believed, you just had enough hope, everything would be great. If we could just get enough hope in the world, all the problems would be solved. All the brokenness would, right? If we could just, but hope doesn't resolve the tension. After this majestic call to hope here in chapter 3, the poet returns us to the destruction that is sitting outside his front door. And I think part of the reason we're bad at lamenting is because we want confession to just fix it. Right? We want to come to God, acknowledge, hey, this is kind of messed up. That was probably my fault. And we want all of the consequences of that to just be resolved. But the poet understands that's not the way the world works. And so he brings us back to the despair all around him. We want confession to just fix it. We want our faith rewarded with immediacy. But that's not how hope works. Because hope is the steadfast certainty that God is still good, even in the midst of bad circumstances. Hope carries you through the storm, but it does not necessarily remove the clouds. And so the poet points us to hope grounded in the character of God, His unfailing love, His covenant faithfulness, who He has proven Himself to be. He grounds us in that hope and then plops us right back into the middle of the mess with the intent that our hope in who God is will carry us through. That it will cause us to lean into the sacred rather than drift off into the cynical. By the end of the book, hope hasn't prevailed. And so the book of Lamentations kind of comes to its conclusion with this hanging question like, God, are you still there? God, do you remember us? Are you so angry that this can't be put back together? Will you forget us forever? But how did chapter 5 begin? Remember, O Lord, what has happened to us. Let me invoke the long history of God's relationship with His people to hold out hope that this present reality will not become our permanent circumstance. And the book leaves us unsettled because nothing's changed. The city is still destroyed. The ruins of the temple are still smoking and smoldering. The exiles are still carried to Babylon. And all we are left with is hope. But it's hope in light of who God has revealed Himself to be. A God of unfailing mercy. A God of great faithfulness. You see, gang, it's only when you abandon your right to feel hopeless that you find hope right there with you sitting in the dark. We come into the midst of the mess at times, and we become angry, we become cynical, we become bitter, and we say, I have a right to feel like hope is gone. And the poet of Lamentations goes, yeah, I get that. Can I tell you about the faithfulness of God in the midst of the mess? Can I tell you about the faithfulness of God that if you will cry out, remember us, O Lord, you'll find that He's sitting right there with you in the dark the whole time. For the people of God, the poet is writing about, writing to, hope would be delayed. We don't like that. Remember, we're bad at lament because we want confession to just fix it. Lord, sorry, everything's back the way it should be, right? That's what we want to happen, but that's not reality. Hope was delayed. For 70 years, the exiles would stay in Babylon. Eventually, the people would hearken the advice of the prophet Jeremiah, who told them to settle in for the long haul. Build homes, start families. This isn't changing anytime soon. But the same prophet that told them to to build homes in Babylon was instructed by the Lord to go and buy a field in Judah because we're coming home. And hope would be delayed. After 70 years, in 539 BC, Babylon would fall to the Medo-Persian Empire. And under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, some of the exiles would return home and begin rebuilding the city of Jerusalem, reconstructing the Holy Temple. But Persia still remained in charge, at least until they were conquered by the Greeks, who in turn were conquered by the Romans, creating a scenario where despite God's people being home in the land with a new temple constructed for worship, many still long for God to remember His people, to fulfill His long-standing covenant promises to send them a Savior King. And it's in the journey of that Savior King, the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, that we begin to understand the depth of God's faithfulness. Because when God takes on flesh and walks among us, He comes face to face with death and destruction and the worst kind of human violence we can imagine. And hope would be revealed when God raised Jesus from the dead. So the poet of Lamentations doesn't know anything about that yet. All he knows is he finds himself in the midst of the mess where sin and human brokenness has done its worst. And his message to the people of God: don't drift to the cynical. Lean in to the sacred. Because in a life of faith, despair never gets the last word. Hope does. Always. I want to invite the band to come back. Continue in worship this morning, but we still have a little bit of time left with the book of Lamentations. We want to take a book like this and say, okay, so what do we do with it, right? Because if we're honest, we're not really sure what to do with it. It's one of those parts of the Old Testament that seems especially foreign to us. People living in a world that doesn't seem anything like ours. In circumstances we hope and pray we will never have to face. And so we're not sure what to do with the book of Lamentations. It just seems so foreign. And yet when we begin to see the totality of the book, there's something about it that feels strangely familiar. There's something about it that reminds us of those moments where our faith hangs in the balance. Where the challenges of sin and brokenness leave us at a crossroads, and we have to decide whether we're going to drift towards the cynical. What God could there actually even be? Or whether we will lean into the sacred. Say there is a God who has revealed Himself to be incredibly faithful. Whose promises are always true. Whose mercies are made new every morning. In those moments, the poet of Lamentation meets us, knowing what it's like to be there. Because his words are kind of frozen in time. The poet is sitting right there in the midst of that mess. saying, I get it. I feel it. And as the poet sits with us in the dark, he points us at times very gently, but at other times very graphically, to the one who sits with us. The one who meets us in the mess, the one who stares down death itself and came away victorious. And he reminds us, no matter the circumstance, in a life of faith, despair doesn't get the final word. Hope does. Always. Let me pray for us.